Georgia Broadband Program. We are excited, obviously, to announce that the BEAD grant portal as of yesterday morning is open to receive applications and will be open through January 15th at 5 p.m. And with that, what we're going to do is just do kind of a quick run through of the program, some of the additions since our last webinar that we've made potentially to our frequently asked questions. And then more so than anything, we wanted to allow for time today to also answer your questions. In addition, we will be sending out more information today via our listserv email group where in addition to the two webinars, with this being the second one that we've done, we will also be doing office hours. Again, as we've always said, please feel free to reach out to us individually at our inbox at broadband@gta.ga.gov. However, again, we do also on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And any Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday that is not available, we'll obviously let everyone know in advance. We'll be offering office hours with our subject matter expert, so that way also if you do have questions, that there is also kind of an open time to join us to also ask those questions related to the application. But so with that, again, as many know at this point, but Georgia's BEAD allocation was just over $1.3 billion, where we've received just under $5 million thus far in planning funds, which has gone to so far bolster our functions here in our office and create all of the deliverables that have been required by NTIA to get to the point that we are today. We still do have significant planning funds available that we're again using those to support the program and our staff. As everybody knows, 2023 was very much a planning year. 2024 has brought us our approval of our Volume 1, which details our challenge process, Volume 2, which details our grant process, and that now we, having an approved Volume 1 and Volume 2 and approved challenge process data, are now able to actually open our grant. And so with that, 2025, we'll see provisional awards being made, and then also turning in our final proposal to NTIA for approval so that way we can go ahead and actually get moving forward with the projects. Based on the outcome of our challenge process, there are just over 70,000 unserved locations and just over 93,000 underserved locations for a total of 165,000 BEAD eligible, roughly, locations that are eligible in our countywide project areas. As you can see, obviously, a majority of the locations in Georgia, based on FCC data, are served with just under 3.7 million showing in the fabric as served locations. But again, our focus for this project is 165,074 locations that are BEAD eligible. Again, as everybody I think is familiar at this point with our Volume 2, which is available on our website, it details obviously the grant program structure of the BEAD grant, along with our scoring criteria and all of the application requirements that will also go into further detail today. We have obviously been in stage 1 for quite some time of preparing applications, getting our Volume 2 approved, putting out the countywide project areas, and then getting our challenge process data approved. And now we are happy to be receiving applications in our portal through January 15th. After that, we'll obviously go into a scoring phase. Phase 3 of this is obviously getting the data once we establish our extreme high cost threshold from the actual data from that's submitted in round 1. And then at that point, that'll allow us to go into the negotiation phase, which at that point, the state will reach out to the highest scoring applicants for specific project areas and ultimately determine if there are kind of any other areas that can be added into those project areas for counties that didn't receive a bid. And then at that point, the state will be offering provisional awards. And then that way, anybody that's offered a provisional award that accepts will then be included in the state's final proposal to NTIA for ultimate approval. As we've discussed before, we are doing countywide project areas. But one thing I did want to discuss in a little bit further detail, I'll skip ahead actually a couple of slides and come back to these, is one thing that we've recently added following the previous webinar that we've done is based on pending guidance from NTIA right now. We have received a lot of questions about how locations can be removed from the eligible data set, whether that's a location that is currently showing in the fabric that you believe should not be a BSL. So essentially a hay bale, a structure that is not something that should be a broadband serviceable location. We have put guidance out on our website at broadband.georgia.gov, where you can click on it here and essentially see the NTIA location removal 1.1 guidance, along with our template that we will need to receive from you if you're looking to submit any of those locations for the state's review for them to be removed. Again, this is pending guidance from NTIA, but right now we will be essentially allowing providers to submit data to broadband at gta.ga.gov, again, using the template that's available on the website. For reason codes 1 through 5 right now, we're not accepting reason codes 6 and 7 because that's really kind of a different use via NTIA for us later in the final proposal process. But again, number 1, and number 2 really kind of go into what I just described, where essentially it's a location that's showing as a BSL in the fabric, but it really shouldn't be a location, whether that's a barn, a hunting shack without electricity, a hay bale. We've heard obviously from a number of providers that as you look more closely at the fabric in the project areas, that, we do know that locations like this exist in the fabric. And so these will be the codes that you enter into the spreadsheet in order to submit that data to the state for our review and for a final determination if that location should be eligible for BEAD or not. We are also, number 3 is a process that the state ourselves is looking at. As we continue to see new versions of the FCC map, new versions of the fabric, obviously locations get added and locations get removed. Obviously we cannot remove any or cannot add any locations to BEAD eligibility based on NTIA's guidance. However, if locations based on reason code 3 here are removed from the fabric, that is something that the state throughout this process will be checking the data to see ultimately if the FCC removes locations, ultimately working to also remove those from the eligible data sets that are online. Also, number 4 for enforceable funding commitments. So again, we should have all of the data for all of the current enforceable funding commitments. However, if there are any additional enforceable funding commitments or any locations that potentially need to be added into enforceable funding commitments, obviously you'd use code number 4 here. And then number 5 is something that we're going to be looking at generally on a limited basis, but if a location is already served by non-subsidized service, so essentially the provider can prove that the location has already been served, and they are not going to be applying for it for BEAD or want it to essentially be removed from the BEAD eligible data set. We'll also be receiving location level information for those as well. As we clarified in our FAQs, it kind of describes this process of location removal and essentially how it must be submitted to the state to the email address using our template. And for enforceable funding commitments, and also number 5, subsidize or service that is not subsidized, so essentially a location that's already been served, we will only be receiving those from providers that actually serve the location, because based on NTIA's guidance and what the state will be accepting to obviously substantiate service at those locations, is essentially the evidence that's laid out on the website, where we really want to make sure that that provider is attesting and providing that data directly to the state that they can serve that location, rather than another provider just submitting to say, we believe somebody else serves this. So again, happy to answer any further questions on that. But with that, I'm just going to jump back a couple of quick slides. Again, this is our scoring rubric that's been available for quite some time in our volume 2. Again, the first 75 points outlined by NTIA, with it being focused on the total outlay of BEAD funding, affordability and compliance with fair labor laws, and then the state secondary criteria of speed to deployment, community and local government support, picking up community anchor institutions at no additional cost to the state, As we've also noted in our FAQs, we do know that there are some project areas that don't contain any eligible community anchor institutions. In that case, the state will just automatically be awarding the full 3 points to any applicant for that project area, because obviously it is not within your control that there are not eligible locations for community anchor institutions in that area. We do also know, and we've clarified in our FAQs as well, that we do have a handful of project areas where only community anchor institutions are eligible. And so we've also outlined how those particular project areas will be scored as well. We also do believe, though, there also could be some challenges filed on those community anchor institutions, given the process that I just described, though, that they're potentially already served. And so we will make sure to keep everybody up to date using obviously our listserv and our website of any potential locations that have been challenged through essentially the location removal process. Periodically, we will post a new list as frequently as we possibly can, letting people know at least the locations in question that are potentially being submitted by providers for removal. So that way, obviously, if those are in a particular project area that you're looking to apply for, you're aware that there is the potential that the state might come back and ask you to remove those locations before you get to a final award. That would all be discussed with the applicants in the negotiation phase, so that obviously if they needed to amend their bid for locations being removed because they're no longer eligible, obviously they would have the opportunity in the negotiation phase to amend that as well. But it's definitely our goal to keep you up to date as much as we possibly can for the locations in question that might be removed. Again, we're not expecting this to be a really significant number of locations, but we also think that this is a really important part of the process to make sure that obviously locations like hay bales and barns are not being included in grant funded areas when there was really not the intention for those to be considered broadband serviceable locations. In addition, obviously, it is not our goal to overbuild locations that have qualifying reliable service. And so obviously that's why there's the option with anybody with an enforceable funding commitment, and or if the location is already served, that you can submit for those locations to be considered by the state for removal as well. So with that, and we will get into it a little bit more as we lead into round 2 of our application when we're looking at other types of technologies. But just wanted to again include that the scoring matrix is slightly different as we move forward into different rounds as we're looking at different technologies. Again, however, round 1 for the application is fiber only to the premises. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Jen Wade to briefly kind of go through some of the application requirements. And then, but again, more so than anything today, we definitely want to make sure we leave plenty of time for your questions.
Great, thank you. Yes, as Jessica said, I'm Jen Wade. I'm a director over RSM. I do want to highlight, although I will not get into every single one of these, just to leave enough room at the end, as Jessica mentioned, for questions. As some of you on the call may have had previous awards under state fiscal recovery funds and capital project funds, wanted to highlight, and you probably already know this, that BEAD obviously has additional requirements on top of some of the similar requirements for those programs as well. They differ from many of the previously funded broadband programs that you all may have. And so just wanted to highlight a few of these in this list. It's not exhaustive, but budget, your budget will be much more detailed in the BEAD application. Your eligible expenses are different under the BEAD requirements, including pre-award costs and things like that. And if you look through the technical assistance guide and the manual that we have online, you'll find some, in the FAQs, you'll find some of those pre-award costs and eligible expenses that are dating back to anything that is pre-construction costs. There is a match requirement under BEAD with specific waivers that you can read through under the guidelines. There is a letter of credit or performance bond requirement as well. Cybersecurity and supply chain risk management requirement, the obvious monitoring compliance component, The payment structure, although similar, is a little bit different than the previous programs, and the reporting requirements as well. Next slide, please. So for your budget, your pre-award cost expenses should be clearly defined in the budget, so they align to the pre-award costs that are eligible, as well as the narrative. Just wanted to note here that applicants do assume any of the responsibility for pre-award costs that are put into your budget upon application in the event they do not win an award, or in the event that they are not eligible. So I would strongly encourage you to go back through the guidelines and the FAQs to read what is an allowable pre-award expense and what is allowable within the budget as a whole within the BEAD program as well. GTA will allow limited permissible activities under NEPA to proceed using award funds prior to the completion of the EHP review process. So if you are not aware, construction, breaking ground and things like that cannot occur prior to the EHP review process. There's a list of limited permissible activities that we have outlined in the FAQs to allow you to inform your budget when you're putting in your application. And then again, just make sure you account for all applicable cost categories in your budget and just make sure that's thorough. And I wanted to really hit home on the narrative portion of the budget. When you're filling it out, it's great that you are very thorough in the numbers and the description that you put within your budget, but there is a portion of the application that asks for a detailed narrative. Please make sure that that narrative shows how the equipment or whatever you're requesting in your budget aligns to the project and the allowable use of the funds. Next slide, please. So here, eligible expenses, again, we've outlined this online too, so I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. However, you'll note that construction's allowable, long-term leases, deployment, etc., design and permitting. And so here, number 4, that relates to those limited permissible activities and the pre-award costs. Lots of questions around personnel costs, etc. So here is a list of those. And again, those are outlined in the FAQs and in the guides as well. Next slide. Here is the limited permissible activity. So again, dating back to those, pre-award costs that I was just mentioning. So again, based on the guidelines, there are a limited amount of activities that NTIA will allow the state to use prior to the NEPA EHP review process. So your pre-construction planning information, you're collecting to complete the environmental reviews, applications for environmental permits, studies, administrative costs, pre-award application costs, and that differs from previous programs, activities supporting consultations required under the NHPA, Endangered Species or Clean Water Act, or limited preliminary procurement, including the purchase or lease of equipment, etc. And again, that bottom note here, subrecipients that undertake unauthorized project activities in contravention of this information proceed at their own risk and may face the obligation of funding if you are awarded. Furthermore, subrecipients that incur costs prior to the execution of final award agreement proceed at your own risk and may face rejection if deemed unallowable. Next slide, please. So again, we talked about the match requirement. So generally, funds from other federal sources may not be used as match. However, IIJA does provide that matching funds for BEAD can come from, a couple of different sources, namely the Families First Coronavirus Act of 2020, the CARES funds of 2020, Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, and then some loan funding issued through a federal agency, such as the USDA Reconnect program, may also be used for match funding. Next slide. The BEAD program does allow for in-kind match, and so wanted to briefly highlight what this means. So any in-kind match is also known as in-kind contributions. It is a non-cash donation of property, goods, or services which benefit a federally assisted project. It may count towards satisfying the non-federal match requirement of a project's total budgeted cost. I do want to highlight, though, if you use in-kind match in the application, you are asked to also document the valuation, et cetera, of your in-kind match, as GTA is required to maintain documentation to justify that valuation of any in-kind, property, equipment, goods and services, anything like that that's contributed towards meeting that BEAD match requirement. So making sure that the subrecipient or applicant here in this case can document clearly how that valuation was assigned, making sure that you maintain detailed records on the contribution, not just during the application process, but if you were to be awarded throughout the life cycle of the grant and the retention period as well. Next slide, please. Letter of credit performance bonds. So during the application phase, you'll be required to certify that you are aware and understand the letter of credit or alternative performance bond requirement outlined in the BEAD NOFO. So again, just a certification. And then you will be required to advise if you'll be using the letter of credit or performance bond. Next slide, please. While in the application phase, you're just certifying that you can meet the requirement and that you understand it. There will be a later phase where you will actually provide the letter of credit or performance bond documentation, and that is going to be in between preliminary award and final award. So you'll get a preliminary award if you are awarded in a county project area, and then after that, in between the phase of preliminary award to executing your final terms and conditions agreement with the state, that is at the time that you will be asked to provide the documentation of either the letter of credit, performance bond alternative. Next slide, please. Again, cybersecurity and supply chain risk management, there is a component that is required here. It does have to align with NIST framework, and to assist all applicants in this requirement, we have put up a toolkit online to walk you through what that looks like to align to the NIST framework. I do want to highlight, though, that at the time of application, you do have to attest that, either if you already are working as an ISP, you should already have a cybersecurity plan in place. If you're a new entrant, you would need to certify that you will be able to do that. So again, it's a certification on the application phase. And then during the monitoring phase of this, we will ask you for your plan, and that will be compared against the NIST framework to ensure it does meet the requirements of the BEAD program. Next slide, please. Throughout the program, the state is required to conduct monitoring and compliance. NTIA will conduct ongoing monitoring for the states too, to ensure that it is meeting the monitoring and compliance requirements. So just wanted to highlight some expectations. If you are awarded as a subrecipient, you can expect thorough and structured monitoring, very much in line with what we're doing in state fiscal recovery funds and CPF. So you should expect, site visits, desk reviews, self-assessments, reporting, etc. And just be prepared to provide, documentation, making sure that you're following the records retentions, detailed expenditure reports, and proof of compliance with any of the regulations and requirements under the BEAD program. You may be asked to share internal policies and procedures, demonstrating internal controls, and participate in discussions with monitoring staff to clarify practices and address any other potential compliance issues. Next slide. I wanted to highlight this. This is something that we have utilized previously in terms and conditions agreements. It's just an excerpt for cooperation with monitoring, audits, records requirements, and assessments. Basically indicates that all records and expenditures are subject to the monitoring and compliance that I just laid out. Next slide, please. Payment structure. So the state will utilize a fixed subaward structure with a performance-based method of repayment, similar to the State Fiscal Recovery Fund and CPF repayments. Subrecipients under this fixed subaward are not required to comply with the cost principles under uniform guidance pursuant to NTIA's policy update. So for those of you that were awarded State Fiscal Recovery Fund, CPF, or are familiar with it, there was a uniform guidance update in May of 2023. NTIA has harmonized with this update. And as such, the state will utilize the fixed subaward. So it does make some of the uniform guidance not applicable. So I would encourage all applicants to, go through the guidance to see what is applicable and what is not. But that procurement piece of that and the cost principles is not applicable under the fixed sub-award structure. Reach and grant milestones. Oops, sorry. Almost there. GTA will require reporting of the grant milestones outlined in the volume 2. And then you will have to provide compliant documentation. So once you meet those milestones, that repayment can occur. Okay, next slide. Semi-annual reporting includes a minimum of the following: speed, pricing and fees, interconnection agreements, contracts and subcontracts, data and mapping, completion of SF 425 forms by the state, and then labor reporting for projects with $5 million or more in total project costs. So again, we're seeing Davis-Bacon or the allowable alternative in the reporting requirements for projects with $5 million or more. And again, this is total project costs. The BEAD compliance requirements, again, just to highlight, we could talk for hours on the many requirements, but Build America, Buy America, in previous programs like CPF and state fiscal recovery funds, these were a preference, and it is a requirement currently. So that is a requirement under BEAD as well as NEPA. Again, under the previous, those two programs I mentioned, NEPA was not applicable, and it is a requirement under BEAD as well as the National Historic Preservation Act. Next slide, please. And here, I'm going to kick it over to CTC to walk through the technical requirements of the BEAD program and your application.
Hey, this is Jessica. So I'm just going to jump in and do kind of a high-level overview, and then we can kind of go into the additional slides if we have any questions kind of about this particular section. So obviously Jen just kind of gave a thorough overview of a lot of what we're looking to see, primarily in a lot of the gating criteria that hopefully you've had a chance to log into the portal, or you've had a chance to review the available application questions that are on GTA's website. But obviously one of the things that going through NTIA's Notice of Funding Opportunity and then also the state's approved Volume 2 is that we have to obviously get, a lot of information related to your proposal, whether that's your technical narrative, your network design, logical network drawings, certainly your project cost, timeline is obviously something that we're looking to see to obviously make sure that you're able to be compliant with the timeline of the program, and also another scored component as well of, based on how quickly you're able to complete the project, being able to receive additional points in that category as well. We have received questions around the professional engineering certification. That can be from a professional engineer that's certified, that does have the proper credentials in any state. It does not have to be the state of Georgia. Your capital investment schedule, and then obviously the environmental and climate factors that are also required that the state collects based on NTI's Notice of Funding Opportunity. We do have a lot of additional slides kind of discussing a lot of these items in more detail, but I also do think that everybody's had the opportunity from our previous webinar, but then also to look through application questions to kind of dive into the requirements that we have around kind of the technical capabilities and requirements. But so with that, I really want to make sure that we leave sufficient time to open the floor for your questions. And then again, a copy of this presentation, and I know I'm skipping ahead of a lot of slides here that you've seen before, will be online, so you can certainly go back and read or reference any of the things that we've discussed today, and obviously go back and watch portions of this webinar if that would be helpful for you as well. Again, before I open it up for questions, I just want to again highlight for anybody that joined us over the last few minutes that, again, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, again, we'll be sending out reminders, but we will be doing office hours at 1 p.m. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So again, if even if you don't have questions or don't necessarily have questions for this group, we're always available if you'd like to email us at broadband@gta.ga.gov. Or we also encourage you to join us during our office hour sessions. We are trying to make all resources available so that we can answer your questions as quickly as possible, and do everything that we can assist in obviously, hopefully having a great response to our BEAD application. So with that, I'd love to go ahead and open the floor for questions. If you'd like to either come off of mute or drop your questions in the chat, we will be happy to entertain both. Let's see. The first question that we see here in the chat, is there a floor or ceiling for services provided, such as training, computer equipment? So as of right now, for the infrastructure side of the BEAD grant, when we're looking at the deployment costs, based on the structure of legislation, we have to get of the roughly 65,000 locations I mentioned earlier, we have to show that we can deploy funds to first the unserved locations that are eligible, the underserved locations that are eligible, and then the community anchor institutions. And then at that point, we will be able to then move into what NTIA deems as non-deployment expenses. And so I think more so maybe related to the question about training or computer equipment, as that might pertain more to digital connectivity or some obviously initiatives that we have around non-deployment uses. That will be kind of forthcoming as we ultimately see how much we have available, potentially, if any, for non-deployment. If you have any additional questions or kind of want to elaborate further on that question, certainly happy to discuss that. Let's see. Does BEAD funding allow does BEAD allow funding for upgrading an existing network? I feel like that's a little bit of a difficult question to answer, because ultimately BEAD funding essentially has to go to, again, as I mentioned, the unserved and underserved locations and how you would serve those. If something's an existing network where those locations are already deemed as served by the FCC and NTIA, they will not be eligible for the program. If there is an existing network in place where those locations are deemed as unserved or underserved, that's certainly something that we would like to take a further look at. Again, if you could email us at broadband@gta.ga.gov about more specifics, we're happy to have our team and our subject matter experts take a look at that. Again, that's more of a unique question, but again, the goal of the program is getting to the unserved and underserved locations that are part of the state's eligible data set. And so obviously, I think that we have some flexibility in the program of how we get there. But if it's currently a network where those locations are already deemed as served, they would not be eligible for the program. But again, having some additional details so we can understand the kind of total scope of the question, we would love for you to reach out to us individually on that. How do I get added to the list for receiving a notification about webinars and office hours? That's a great question. So if you'll go to our website, which is gta.ga.gov, and you can sign up for our newsletter. We can also drop it, William, if you would drop that in the chat here. Well, I was gonna say William's already on it. So please just go to our website and you can sign up for our newsletter list. I strongly encourage everyone on the call today. Obviously, I have a feeling most everybody is on our newsletter list because you're joining us today. But we really encourage you, if you are not signed up for that, please do so, because that is always how we're going to push out information about the program, any new updated guidance, updates to our frequently asked questions. All of that will continuously be pushed out using our newsletter list. Is there a separate digital connectivity grant? Yes. Well, the answer is yes, but then also depending on if we ultimately, as I mentioned before, have non-deployment dollars available, it is possible that we could also focus on digital connectivity with those non-deployment dollars. However, we're not going to know until we have made it to the statutorily required groups of locations first. However, yes, there is a state digital equity capacity grant that the state has been approved for. It's just right at $22.5 million. The state is currently finalizing our notice of funding opportunity for that program.
With this jibber jabber, what now?
Hi, if we could go ahead and get everybody to please be on mute. And then so we will be releasing additional information using our same newsletter group for the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant. We're working on our notice of funding right now, funding opportunity, and then dates for that program will also be released shortly. But yes, there is a separate grant, but then also if we do have additional non-deployment dollars eligible or and available, then we will also be looking at a number of the items that we've outlined in our volume 2 as well. Can you please talk about how the extreme high cost threshold and how to incorporate that into applications? So essentially, as I mentioned, so the extreme high cost threshold is essentially a mechanism that NTIA has put in the notice of funding opportunity where for your, very high cost locations that could, drastically impact how much BEAD funding you're asking the state for in your application, that essentially it also gives the state a mechanism to figure out, where is deploying fiber and wireline infrastructure not feasible or not economically viable. And so at that point, when we receive all of the bids from round 1, we're going to see ultimately, where does the state set the threshold of where we essentially deem that location is too expensive, at least based on the current bids that we've received for fiber to the premises. That being said, there's a mechanism in the actual application itself, and we outlined in our volume 2, where applicants, even though we've drawn countywide project areas of eligible locations, applicants do have the ability to remove locations from their application if it greatly impacts the cost of your bid. So you'll see in the portal, in that particular section, there's going to be 2 spreadsheets you're going to upload. One is going to be a template that we've provided where you upload the list of all of the BSLs that you're proposing to serve within the eligible project area. And then there's also going to be a secondary list that if there are any locations that you're proposing to remove, that you will also upload that spreadsheet. And there's also a notes and reason section in that template where you'll essentially describe why that location is being removed. And that could be because, it drastically impacted the cost of your particular bid. Let me see what else we've got. How can I receive the current list of location IDs for the county that I'm applying for? So those are available online at broadband.georgia.gov. You'll see that along with all of the other application materials, the questions, our FAQs, NTIA's guidance about location removal. You'll see right on that main page that there's also the list of the approved unserved, the approved underserved, and the approved community anchor institutions as well. And you also see in the chat that William has dropped a link in for that as well. The next question is, what is the best way to separate by county? So I'm not completely sure about the question, but so we have drawn countywide project areas. There is, again, an ability for providers to remove locations that they're not proposing to serve in the application, that you will indicate to the state by uploading the list of locations you're proposing to serve versus the locations you're proposing to take out of the project area. I would point everybody back to the scoring rubric, though, in the line about universality of applications, where you can receive up to 8 points by keeping as many locations intact in the project area as possible. And we also indicate in the state's volume 2 that, drastic removal of locations that could be deemed cherry picking by the state could actually ultimately disqualify an application. However, there is a process, again, using those 2 templates to indicate to the state which locations you would be removing. So if that is how you're trying to split up a county. The other possibility for also splitting a county is we are allowing for partnership applications. And so if there's a scenario that a particular ISP would like a portion of the county, and another ISP would like another portion of the county, obviously, when we were working on developing our plan, and we had to kind of geographically design project areas. We understand that there's really no one particular geography that perfectly aligns with how telecom networks work. And so we also wanted to allow for the idea of partnership applications to be mindful of, companies, ILEC territories, electric co-op territories. But ultimately, our goal here is that, we do have to get to 100% of the eligible locations and get a funding commitment to serve those locations. So we've tried to add, again, additional kind of flexibility into the programs for either removing locations or partnering with somebody to still get full points or most points for the universality of application section, so that you're still covering a majority of the grant area. Okay, so the question was about filtering the data by approved county locations. So that is something that also, please feel free to reach out to us at broadband at gta.ga.gov. So that is something that, based on the CostQuest agreement, which is the provider of the master address file that the FCC works with, essentially in order to decipher the data, because we're only able to put the Fabric ID number out on our website publicly. That's essentially the unique identifier. You will have to compare that to the full CostQuest data set, which will give you obviously the county, the address level information, the lat long of that particular location. But if you don't have access to that data, please feel free to reach out to us, and our team will connect you with CostQuest so that you can get access to that data and ultimately filter that. You will just have to sign a license agreement with CostQuest to receive certain counties' data. And so they've been very responsive. NTIA has purchased that license agreement for state and applicants' use. So it is a free agreement. And usually their turnaround is very quick. You just need to make sure that you do have that data set to be able to essentially decipher the actual address level information as it ties to a Fabric ID of essentially how we have to communicate with those unique identifiers of the list of eligible locations. With that, I think I've run through all of the questions that we've seen in the chat throughout. William and Jen have also provided a lot of additional information. So great information in the chat, but also just wanted to open it up if anybody would like to come off mute and ask any questions, or any other questions that we might not have in the chat that someone would like to add while we're all together as a group. All righty. Well, hearing none, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We're, again, very excited to actually have our application window for the BEAD program now open. If you have any issues with the portal, any application questions, please feel free, again, to always reach out to us at broadband at gta.ga.gov. Our entire team monitors that inbox. That is certainly the fastest way to get a response from our office. Again, we'll be sending out information later this afternoon with the link to our office hours. Again, 1 p.m. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And so, again, we want to make sure that we're an available resource to you, and certainly hope that you're going to participate in this program. And thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.